Hi, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video. On the topic of this video will be on analytical epistemology and MBTI. And the nature of this video is to explain the basis of my thoughts that underpin the analyses of personality and personality theory that you find in my videos, and why I say some of the things I say, and where the basis for these things are stemming from, as there is a greater epistemological approach and metaphysics behind what is behind the propositions that I put forth. And I have been thinking this way as an individual for 22 years, essentially, because I think it is geared by introverted thinking, and I don't really take these cues from any formal philosophical school or tenet, though I use these descriptive terms to explicate, in a sense, the general camp I sit in as a thinker and how I'm approaching my analyses of MBTI, personality theory, and whatever else I think about. It's excluded to MBTI and personality theory, and this is the meta structure of what it is, how it is I think about things in the world. And it's first to say that epistemology is the study of knowledge, roughly. Metaphysics is the study of what exists. Ontology is a subset of metaphysics and talks about what is that exists specifically, and metaphysical epistemology is about what we can know given what exists. And classically in philosophy, there has been the description of knowledge, or the definition of knowledge, or when one knows something, is having a justified belief. For the analytical school introduced a distinction between belief and knowledge. However, in my thinking, I do not make that distinction per se, because justifying one's beliefs has to do with a school of epistemological thought in of itself. Essentially, people have to use metrics of correspondence insofar as whatever one thinks has to correspond to reality, or coherence, and whatever one thinks has to fit with the already made patterns and schemas that exist in their mode of thoughts and the other propositions that they have by way of whatever experience they get them from. Normative knowledge insofar as, or a consensus, or normative knowledge and consensus, saying what we decide upon or what we agree on, or what is broadly accepted, is what constitutes what one uses to justify themselves. People can get rather semantical and picky insofar in saying that not all justification is valid. However, it is my view as a materialist and an empiricist to say that even empirical measures are substantiated by quantification. That is oftentimes what individuals get wrong about the scientific method, because people initially think, and it is by way of the school of empiricism and its advent and its proclamations during the 19th century, that people say that that's where, in terms of Hume and Bacon, that's where the scientific thought is housed in, but really it isn't housed in the school of quantification, and the precept or axiom that what can be quantified and compare constitutes what can be scrutinized. And essentially, if something can be scrutinized and quantified and reproduced, in a sense, on multiple platforms, it's not in event horizons, one can say. It's not necessarily one's senses, because science has definitely shown that our senses and our local intuitions can deceive us. It's per se by using means of quantitative reasoning and analytical scope in quantitative reasoning that scientific truth is come to, and we use experiments to get metrics and quantifiable objects per se, and that's where the thought and the conclusions are based on, where deduction happens, and where we come up with conclusions. But there's a very real problem in this, and I think it's this, that whatever is unquantifiable is meaningless per se. It does not contribute to knowledge in that mode of thinking, in the scientific mode of thinking, in which the scientific philosophy is a subset of empiricism that is most tightly associated with logical positivism, or logical rational positivism, or rational amaterialism, which isn't empiricism in of itself, but really like an evolution of it, and was really honed and but a philosophical movement around the mid and the end of the 19th century, and that's basically where science fits in. And this idea that knowledge is what one justifies, the thing is, things can be justified on multiple levels of resolution, and it has to do with a lot of times in what one considers justification for something that one says that they know is their stance on metaphysics, what they think actually exists and what they think is. And I think that human beings in of ourselves are flawed, and we cannot know explicitly or with a great deal of certainty what is and what exists. I'm a skeptic per se in that way, and next I would be, outside of being a skeptic, would be being a existentialist and a phenomenologist, and saying that the only thing I know, and I don't know a lot of things. I say that very really, because I can't be certain I exist. I can't be certain other people exist. I'm not and this is where it throws off a lot of people insofar as me being a physics major and a budding scientist, is that the collection of propositions I hold per se as an individual greatly influences how I look at science, and how I look at empiricism, and how I look at all knowledge per se, and why I do not accept that classical view on knowledge, because what one will consider knowledge, it comes down to a greater, larger metaphysical framework, and I don't see how that per se, because what can be justified in one school of thought may not be justifiable in another. And I use the term schools of thought because I do think knowledge in of itself is a construction in many ways. I don't think knowledge is something that is purely objective. I think it has very much a anthropomorphic basis for it, insofar as that knowledge is something that's fundamentally human, and it's something that comes by way of being. It's something that comes by way of our existence, and there is a whole mesh of factors and parameters that get sewn up with that. And I don't have a tradition. I have read philosophy, but I'm not a philosopher insofar as that I'm using any school of philosophy or thought I've been trained in. I do not agree with a lot of things that I read, though I read a lot of philosophy and things like that, because to me there are very real limitations on what one can know just because one is human. I will forever, I think the paper that probably, one of the papers that influenced me heavily was on perception and the perception of bats. And it is insofar as this, that there are different cognitive landscapes that are out in nature insofar as organisms and how they perceive the environment. And human beings do not perceive it the same way as dogs. It's very odd that we're visually based in our perception to where dogs are olfactory. Fishes are, certain schools of fishes, like cod and whatnot, are electromagnetatively based in their perception, as in they perceive waves of electromagnetism. Sharks are like that too. It's just, and bats are auditorily with sonar. It's just that we're not the only kind of existence that's on this planet that is pulling and differentiating information from the environment. So I find it a very anthropomorphically biased view that knowledge is it's possible for knowledge to be completely objective. I don't think it's possible for knowledge to be completely objective. Even though I am an individual that likes truth and values certainty, I do not champion it just given the train of logic and the meaningful bits of information that I found in the system of my thoughts. But I do value it, but it's just to say that just because I value it and just because I'm human does not necessarily mean that that is the way things are, or that stands comparatively with how everything else is related to itself in the world. And how do I know what the world is per se as being a type of creature, an organism in of myself with my own sort of collective drives and goals that do underpin the nature of my existence and drive me to certain means and aims within the environment, and biases me and colors me to see information a certain way in terms of what fits in that ready-made pattern and schematization that is what it means to be human, essentially. There are very really archetypes that are at the helm of human cognition, if you want to call them that are there by way of processes over time that make us what we look like, and our perception and our existence. And it's for those reasons that I do not think that there is complete objectivity in knowledge, that knowledge is fundamentally limited and flawed. And now where do I come at the difference between belief and knowledge? Because I have put in some videos a pejorative sort of marking on beliefs, but I'm not thinking of beliefs in the classical sense of beliefs. I think a belief, what is knowing is doubting. I think this. And what you can doubt upon, you can know, because what you do not take for granted and what you do not have a complete, I would say, acceptance of, irregardless or without respects to other potentialities, if one just simply does not doubt or does not compare essentially and associate differing things with whatever it is that they hold in their mind, they do not know. I think the only thing I can know, similar to Socrates, is what I don't know. But very really, that if I do say I know something, it is to know the dimensions of the system of knowledge it is. Propositions do not exist in isolation. When people don't know something, and when I consider something a belief for someone, is when they do not understand or do not see the limitations to a thing, and do not see the possibilities and the ends to something. I do not think we can know emphatically, per se, what the absolute ends to things are, or even if there are absolutes to begin with. But I think that given the landscape of uncertainty by way of our limited cognition and the incompleteness of knowledge itself, it would be that doubt and just doubt and skepticism, or really a pessimism towards knowledge. I don't know if it's really a pessimism, because I'm not pessimistic about knowledge, but I think that there's a certain doubt one must hold in the things that they necessarily believe. It's just that if you do not see where the holes, because there are holes in everything. I know this, and there is in every collection of worldviews or belief structures that are out there, there are propositions that are true and there are propositions that are false in every person. Nothing anybody knows is completely true. There's no system of knowledge out there without some false propositions contained within it, because we are imperfect at ascertaining what the absolute metaphysical picture is. We do not know what constitutes absolute reality. We can't. We're organisms. That's essentially impossible. By my thoughts, this is what I think. That I don't know if you're going to find this in other philosophers and schools of thought per se. It's why I'm not a logical empiricist, though I very much use logic and empiricism in my conclusions. I'm not a logical empiricist, and I mean the formal school of logical empiricism per se, the philosophical movement that's fairly popular right now in modern thought, that really makes a distinction, goes back to Kantian distinctions between metaphysical knowledge, essentially, and says that you have analytical and the analytical thought that you have a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge, basically analytical versus synthetic, and there is the synthetic analytical knowledge that people can have. And in this school of thought, there are very real distinctions made between meaningful knowledge and meaningless knowledge, and quite honestly, anything that does not fit in the scientific positivism of today is considered meaningless. And this is where I always make my break from scientific positivism or scientism and the scientism that I think plagues the world right now, insofar as that I do not find being and I do not find existence meaningless. And aesthetics, metaphysics, so many things that people do use to make decisions and conclusions about the world are essentially negated and made obsolete. I'm not naive, and I swear I think it's another form of utopianism that exists in the thought of scientific positivism, or what some people call scientism. I do not like it, and I think it's very much an ideology just as much as Marxism or feminism is, and I don't like ideologies, and I'm not an ideologue. So it's to say this, that's the background of my thought, and the system of knowledge I want to go ahead and introduce is what I call analytical empiricism. And it's to say this, and it is even, and this is where it's hard for me to make the distinctions in my thoughts, because it is even the working mechanisms that are behind what I'm saying right now, or what I said previously. It seems that very really, and I don't know if this is necessarily introverted thinking, but very really I have axioms at the helm of my thinking. One axiom is that the world is made up of objects. Another axiom is that objects have properties and dimensions. And objects can be associated and compared to one another because they have properties and dimensions to them. This is an extension, really, or something that's an implicit premise in just the idea that there are objects and objects have properties and dimensions. Properties and dimensions very really mean that there are distinctions and similarities that may exist, because if something shares the same properties and dimensions as another thing, it can be considered the same thing as that thing, and when they differ, they can be considered different things. But there are different levels of resolution and analysis that one can do with these propositions or these axioms per se, and saying that what qualitative values do they put on, and I mean the word qualitative because there is an implicit pragmatism I notice in my thoughts of unification, insofar as certain properties do get greater weight over other ones, and so far as the even more implicit, deeper goal of the introverted, extroverted feeling axis in unification. If something seems justified, and that's where I don't like justified per se, because it's justified to me because I'm an INTP. I know that. It's just because I have the way I think that it's justified to me. It oftentimes makes sense to other people, but I think that that's where the base anthropomorphic structures of introverted thinking functions come from. And I notice when I present my reason to people, they typically agree with it. I don't know why, but it's like, I am not foolish enough to think that that's what is. I just know it's the way I think, and that's why a lot of times I say I think this. But beyond that is because of these thoughts is very really a school of thought in me that says that knowledge is all knowledge is axiomatic. I fundamentally believe this. Even if the axioms aren't explicit, even if they are implicit, there are assumptive metrics and there are assumptive parameters that go at the foundation of anything that someone thinks. It's not even what somebody knows or what somebody believes, but we all make our impressions and very real intuitive notions of what reality is from the time we're babies and we're crawling on the floor, and making our base perception of time and space. Time and space may not be real phenomenons in the or space-time may not be a real phenomena in the way that one would think. Time may not be out in the universe per se. It's just something that we intuitively grab upon and use as humans to make sense because we like causality per se. But there again, is causality an actual thing? I know this, that it is given some, I don't think, at least I think this, that it is given some level of analysis and some resolution of analyses, where these levels and resolutions of analyses should fit in with one another, is despite the current popular belief in science supersedes everything, I think that very really philosophy supersedes all thought, and that science comes underneath it. You do not get any scientific idea without some philosophical system underpinning it. You don't get anything really without some philosophical system underpinning it, or some base assumptions or system of knowledge upholding it. So first, there are axioms and assumptions in everything. You cannot get to any conclusion without assuming something. You will assume things to be able to make conclusions and decisions and judgments about the world. This is a given, and this seems to be fundamentally, in some respects, how people have to operate by way of their innate hardware. And it is from here that I say that all knowledge is some sort of structure. It is. And when I think of myself as an epistemologist, I very much really think that I am looking at knowledge structures and analyzing them as if they were objects and they were shapes from multiple vantage points and rotations and tilts in order to get if foggy at best, still the best perception I can get on what this body of knowledge really is, per se. I think that there is a metaphysics to epistemology, and that knowledge structures very really have a species. There is like a species and a genus to almost everything, that ideas even in of themselves are like various little creatures or species, that they have shelf lives, and they very really have their own makeup in existence as if they were agents and entities. And I think this is where Richard Dawkins gets the idea of the meme, and I think this is where archetypes even, or when Carl Jung said people don't have ideas, ideas have people, because there's very really a landscape that we exist in as conscious beings, per se, or things that at least have the impression that they're conscious, and very much really use abstraction insofar as that we go beyond context and use interpretive measures. We use a multitude of measures insofar as qualitative, objective, interpretive, and empirical to make decisions about things in the world, or essentially to say we know. And it's how we differentiate and structure information, and this differentiation and structure leads to propositions, and all knowledge structures are at the bottom a system of assumptions that have propositions emerging from them that exist in some coherency with one another, and that very really have true or false values to them, and constitute some system of thought or belief. Because I don't ever find whatever someone says to be independent in of itself there. There's always something even deeper than the idea or the thing that someone's saying. There is something at the basement level of thought and thinking that has some sort of connectivity with cognition and what it means to be human, and even deeper than that, what it means to be an organism, that very really influences the conclusions and the thoughts that people can come to. I knew I was an INTP, or at least I have somewhat of a correspondence view in the thinking that I'm an INTP by way of reading philosophy from other philosophers who were proposed to be INTPs. For example, Descartes. It's very strange and very bizarre to me that I do not exist in the same time, space, nor period as Descartes, and I did not know his ideas and his philosophies until I was about 20, and I made this argument when I was about 17 on why I don't trust my senses per se as an individual, and it is I said a pencil in a cup, but he has a stick in a water, and how dimensions and perception can be skewed. When I read that in Descartes, I thought that was original. I thought that I was very original in the conception of that argument, and the people who heard me say that thought it was fairly profound, and I was foolish enough to think it was profound and original at the time. Then I read Descartes and just realized it was water already tread, and I know that, and I think at least I don't know, but I think because, and reading Spinoza as well, it's strange to me. Spinoza, I think, is either an INFJ or an INTP. I'm not sure which, but he very really uses the TIFE axes in terms of coming to conclusions. But it's very bizarre to me when I read the ethics and I see how, very really similar and completely analogous ideas and thoughts emerge from he and I. And the same with Leibniz and his metaphysics. Though I don't share the same beliefs as Leibniz, the system and the manner of reasoning he uses. I just really think he's an introverted thinker. I can hear and see the resounding expositions, if you will, in the voice of certain cognitive functions when I read philosophy and when I read the thoughts of other thinkers, and even when I find theories in mathematics and science. I can usually tell when it was an introverted thinker and extroverted thinker who came up with the idea. And it is to say that knowledge is something that is a product of our cognition, and it is very much a structure, like anything else. Excuse me, because human beings, we seem to be somewhat pragmatists by nature and engineers by nature, insofar as we make things that aren't currently there to aid us, and maybe by way of our imagination or by means of our mind's needs to fill in the blank, per se, as there is a very real fuzzy algorithm and Tacitus form of logic in the brain that makes up the picture of the world that we see and the ideas that we have about the world. And it's very much in this vantage point and in this vein, this greater metaphysical and epistemological context, that all other things I say emerges from. And I have a playlist called Systemic Foundations, and even below those things are these things. And it's to say I explicate these things and I make these things clear because they're really easy for me to do. It's really easy for me to make this video right now, even though I don't have a lot of time to make videos, because I've been thinking about these things for God knows how long. And they're just so innately my own thoughts that I'm not having to have to understand others or anything like that. It's just me saying literally what I think. There is not necessarily, even though I put empirical bits and facts and data even in this, the data corresponds to the theory I already have. I use the data to validate the theory. Even if the data didn't agree with the theory, I would just say I was too soon. I've thought this for a very, very long time, and have a very strong form of logic per se. And I suppose I can give the pure logical argument in another video, but this is essentially on metaphysics and epistemology in relation to MBTI or typology, insofar as this is the way I think about it, and this is what I think about metaphysics and knowledge, essentially. Metaphysics and epistemology, essentially. So that's my video. Most likely, most people aren't going to agree with that. Maybe you find it interesting and insightful, but I doubt that many people are going to agree with what I'm saying. But these are very strongly introverted thinking influenced ideas, so they are fairly idiosyncratic and individualistic. So it is what it. So those are my thoughts for what they're worth, and thank you for watching this video.